Hi, I'm Dave Watts. Welcome to the third part of GSA 200, Advanced Security Cases. In this session, we'll learn how to handle multiple authentication repositories used with a single search by defining credential groups and using the GSA's flexible authorization mechanism. We'll also learn how to build trusted search applications that can send a user's identity to GSA 7.2 or above. In the previous session, we learned about single sign-on. However, many organizations do not have a single sign-on environment that truly covers all of their content. They may have different authentication repositories for different content servers. Here, different authentication repositories implies different sets of usernames and credentials. For example, the same user may have different usernames like Bob S. and B. Smith with different passwords in different credential systems. But we still want users to be able to run a single search across all of those content servers. The GSA supports this with the universal login feature. A single universal login form can authenticate a user against multiple repositories at the same time. Each authentication repository is matched to a credential group, and authorization tests are associated with the appropriate credential group. In all of the previous sessions, you've been using universal login with a single credential group. To add other authentication repositories, simply add other credential groups and specify which authentication repository each should use within universal login auth mechanisms. Only one credential group within universal login can support silent authentication. Credential groups that do not support silent authentication will present fields for the user's credentials within the universal login form. In the diagram shown here, we have two authentication repositories. One is LDAP, and the other is a single sign-on service. A single person may have one set of credentials in each, and these credentials will be different. Each authentication repository may be associated with one or more content servers. When the user runs a search, that user is presented with fields for each authentication repository. One credential group is defined by default. This credential group is named default and requires a username. You can edit this credential group or create additional ones. Credential groups can require a username, and they can be optional. For example, you may have two authentication repositories, but you may also have users who don't have accounts in both of them. When configuring authentication sources, select the appropriate credential group for each. Flexible authorization allows you to specify the order of evaluation for authorization rules using URL patterns or mechanisms and authentication IDs. Authentication IDs can be credential groups or the individual mechanism names entered in universal login auth mechanisms. Flexible authorization can be used to tell the GSA how to authorize documents associated with different authentication repositories. It can also be used to allow fallback authorization mechanisms for a single authentication repository. For example, you may have ACLs for some documents, but not for others. You could use ACLs if they exist, but fall back to the head requester if they don't, or you could specify only some documents use ACLs and others do not. To identify problems with universal login, you can check several places for information. First, you might use serving logs, which show you the serving process for a single query. Many problems can be identified right from serving logs. You might also look at the HTTP request and response headers directly within the browser to ensure that authentication tokens are being received and sent correctly. Use your browser's developer tools for this. The next place to look is the Security Manager logs, which provide deeper insight than serving logs and show information when you're using flexible authorization that serving logs don't show. Finally, if you're using connectors for security, you might also look at their logs. Let's take a look at setting up multiple credential groups. So I'm on my GSA now, and I have two secure content sources. One of them uses HTTP basic authentication, and the other uses cookies. So both of these have already been set up for secure crawl. Under search, I've set up a HTTP-based authentication. So that's set up using the credential group default. And right now, I don't have anything for cookies. So what I'm going to do is go to Universal Login, and I'll edit my default credential group, and I'll change the display name to HTTP group. And I will require a username for this group. Next, I'll create a new credential group. I will call this cookie group. Now, once I've got my two credential groups, I'll go back to Universal Login Auth Mechanisms. And of course, HTTP is already set up to the default credential group. So now I'll go to Cookies and simply import from crawl and index and change my credential group to cookie group. So now I have two different authentication mechanisms, and the Universal Login form will prompt me for both of them. Next, I'll go to Flexible Authorization, and I'm going to add a couple of rules here to basically control those two authentication mechanisms, how they will perform authorization. So I'll choose Head Request, and I'll add a rule for the first URL pattern. Now, in my authentication ID box, I will see the names of my credential groups, and I'll also see the name of the individual authentication mechanisms. So basic one is my HTTP authentication mechanism. Cookie-based one is my group one. So I'll go ahead and choose either the default credential group or the authentication mechanism, and then click on Save. I'll create a second rule, also using Head Request. And here I will use the cookie mechanism and save it. Now I'm going to go ahead and move these two rules so that they precede this rule, which is basically the rule that is used most of the time. So that they will be processed before the default rule. Now that we have everything set up, let's go ahead and run our secure search. First, I'll search against the basic authentication content. And one way to do that very easily is with an in-URL search for the word restricted. At that point, I'm prompted for two sets of credentials, one for basic authentication and one for the cookie group. Now, this search should only come up with results that match basic authentication, the results from Athens with the word restricted in the URL. Let me go ahead and run another search. This time I'll search for documents with the word Washington in the URL. That's where my cookie content is. I'm already authenticated, so when I run the search, I get my results from Washington. Now, if I go back to the GSA and take a look at my serving logs, I can see what happened. I was prompted for 2 sets of credentials, basic auth and forms auth, and both of those credentials were verified. And ultimately, I can see that authentication is successful for both of those. And then I can see my initial search return 4 results. If I look at the second search, this one is a little simpler because I'm already authenticated against both repositories, and so it simply shows me the matching results. Before GSA 7.2, if you wanted to build an application that acted as a proxy to the GSA, and you wanted that application to run secure searches on behalf of users, that application would have had to interact with the GSA just like a user's browser would. With complex authentication mechanisms like Kerberos, this can be very difficult to build. GSA 7.2 introduced a new feature to solve this problem, called Trusted Applications. When this feature is enabled, the GSA will accept either the user's credentials or a verified identity from your application. Your application will be responsible for authenticating users. There are 2 ways trusted applications can be used. A trusted application can be registered on the GSA. If an application is registered, it will have its own credentials that are used for authentication, and it will send the user's identity and the corresponding credential group as 2 HTTP request headers, along with the application's own credentials. Unregistered applications can simply send the username and password of the user that requires authentication. Once the GSA receives the user's identity or credentials, it will use them for group resolution and authorization. To register a trusted application, first, enable trusted applications. Then, add an entry under trusted users or groups for your application. You may optionally specify a domain and user or group name that will correspond with the username sent by your application. You will have to specify whether you want your trusted application to use a username or a group. If you choose a group name, the universal login auth mechanism will have to identify your application's user group membership. Next, you'll have to configure a universal login auth mechanism that will be used by your application. It must match the credential group specified by the trusted users and groups entry. When your application sends its credentials to the GSA, they'll be verified against this auth mechanism. The application will send the user's pre-verified identity and the credential group that should be used for authorization at the same time it sends its own credentials. The .NET code snippet shown here illustrates what a request from a trusted application looks like. The application's own credentials are placed in a basic authentication header, along with 2 custom headers, x_GSA_user and x_GSA_credential_group. The first custom header contains the user's pre-verified identity, and the second contains the credential group that should be used with that identity. The application's request must be sent to the GSA using HTTP POST. Over the next 2 slides, we can see the trusted authentication mechanism for a registered application at work. The application sends its own credentials, shown here using basic authentication. It also sends the 2 custom headers mentioned previously. Then, the GSA Security Manager authenticates the application user account. Next, the search user's identity is marked as pre-authenticated, and group membership is identified if possible for this user. Finally, authorization is performed for the search user. Trusted applications have several important limitations. They require that your application send a username for the search user via HTTP post. You will need to configure a mechanism for group membership resolution in most cases, so that this username can be used with ACLs. With registered applications, the GSA will not be able to use the head requester, so ACLs must be used for authorization. Only one username can be sent to the GSA by a single application. Only two authentication mechanisms are supported for authenticating registered trusted applications: HTTP basic authentication and forms authentication with cookies. For registered trusted applications that authenticate with cookies, the GSA will need to use a cookie cracker for the sample URL so that it can verify the application's identity. If you've enabled trusted applications but have not registered your application, it will simply send the user's credentials to the GSA. These credentials can be used with the head requester. If you want to use ACLs, you will need to identify group membership. In the case of forms authentication with cookies, you will need to use a cookie cracker for the sample URL so that the GSA can verify the user's identity and group membership. Let's take a look at a simple registered trusted application using basic authentication. First, I'm going to need to enable trusted application. So under Search, Secure Search, I'll go to Trusted Applications. I'll check the box to enable trusted applications. Once it's enabled, I'll edit my trusted users and groups. I've put in HTTP user, that's the user I'm going to authenticate as. Under Universal Login Auth Mechanisms, under HTTP, I've got basic authentication configured. Under Policy ACLs, I've put in a pattern already for that content, and I'm allowing two users to read that content, ACL user A and ACL user B. Now, my trusted application itself is written in Cold Fusion, and it's a very simple program. It collects a search query and a search user in HTML form. The form submits the data back to my Cold Fusion application, and then builds a request using the trusted application information. So right up here at the top, we have the app user and app password. Those are going to be sent to a secure search URL, which takes the search query. So we're going to authenticate using that username and password. We're going to build an HTTP request, and we're going to send those two headers, including the search user entered in the search box. Then at the end, we're simply displaying the results in a very simple way. So let me run this program. So I'll search for a word I know shows up in my secure documents. And I'll search as either ACL user A or ACL user B. A successful search shows me this XML output, and if I scroll down in here, I can see that I get back the one document that has the word salmon in it. If I repeat the search with ACL user B, I'll get the same result. Now back on the GSA, if I take a look at serving logs, I can see that I have a user ID of ACL user A for my first search. And inside of the serving logs, you'll notice that we have something called a surrogate authentication mechanism. So my application authenticates successfully using HTTP basic, becomes pre-authenticated, and then passes ACL user A. So ACL user A is what's used to actually determine which documents I'm allowed to see. Likewise, the second search does the same thing except as ACL user B. The ACL user B is allowed to see the same document. This concludes our third presentation, Advanced Security Cases. Thank you for watching, and make sure to watch the other GSA 200 presentations.